Most of the Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal were never shot. Hunger took them, or the fevers that ride in behind it, in the mud a short walk from an airstrip they could not take back. The men who lived through it carried home a name for the place. In their own country, it is not remembered as Guadalcanal. It is remembered as Starvation Island. The name was not a figure of speech. It was a count. In December of 1942, with the dying on the island past 100 men a day, a Japanese naval officer worked out how to read the time a man had left from the look of him and set it down in his diary as a scale. A soldier who could still climb to his feet had perhaps a month. One who could no longer sit up had about a week. Passing water while lying down meant 3 days. Falling silent meant 2. A man whose eyes had stopped blinking would be gone by morning. He was not describing wounds. This was hunger, drawn up as a timetable. The question that hangs over the whole campaign is a plain one. How does an army starve on a green tropical island ringed by ocean with a nation behind it that had swallowed half the Pacific in a single year? The answer runs through one airstrip. When the United States Marines came ashore in August of 1942, they seized an unfinished Japanese airfield near Lunga Point and completed it themselves, naming it Henderson Field. Whoever held that strip held the daylight sky over it and the sea lanes around it. The big, slow cargo ships that carry an army's rice and shells in bulk could not live in those waters while the sun was up. So the enemy fed the garrison the one way still open to them by fast destroyer in the dark, a shuttle the Americans called the Tokyo Express. A warship is not a freighter. Late in the fight, the men from Rabaul were reduced to sealing rice inside steel drums, shoving them off the decks of destroyers running past the coast, and trusting the tide to bring them in. Most of the drums drifted off on the current or sank before anyone could reach them. Here's the thing worth sitting with. The deciding weapon on Guadalcanal was not a weapon. It was the plain fact that one army could be fed and the other could not. The reason the sea belonged to the Americans by day was a scatter of worn-out aircraft flying off that captured strip. The pilots called themselves the Cactus Air Force after the code name for the island, and they worked from a runway of mud and pierced steel plate, low on fuel and parts, outnumbered in the sky for weeks at a stretch. It was enough. As long as those planes could get airborne, no heavy ship could unload in daylight and expect to see nightfall. An entire army's hunger traced back to a few dozen men keeping a muddy field in business. The clearest proof came in the middle of November, when the enemy made the largest throw of the whole campaign. Admiral Yamamoto loaded 11 transport ships with around 7,000 men of the 38th Division, and the food, ammunition, and heavy gear to sustain a real offensive. Battleships were meant to flatten Henderson Field the night before, so the convoy could unload in peace. The battleships failed. When the ships pressed on, regardless, aircraft from Henderson and heavy bombers up from Espiritu Santo fell on them through the daylight hours and sank 7 of the 11. The last 4 ran themselves aground on the beach to land whatever they could before the planes came back. What that final effort put ashore, by the reckoning of the naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, was around 2,000 exhausted men, 260 cases of ammunition, and 1,500 bags of rice. Gone to the bottom with the rest was food meant to feed 30,000 men for 20 days. A garrison of tens of thousands was told to hold an island on that. That was the campaign in miniature, and then in full. The Japanese Navy was fearsome in the dark water off the coast, so fearsome that sailors renamed the strait Iron Bottom Sound for the hulls stacked on its floor, and the enemy won several of the night actions outright. None of it reached the man in the foxhole. A gun duel won at midnight put no rice in his hands by dawn. The men who ran the Tokyo Express knew what it was worth. Japanese sailors had their own name for the destroyer runs, the rat transportation, for the way they darted in by night and fled before light. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who commanded most of them, and did it with more skill than anyone had a right to expect, had already told his superiors what the war games at Rabaul would later confirm, that the island could not be held and should be let go. He was overruled for months, while the men on the beach paid the interest on that delay. The island itself did the rest of the killing. Morrison reached for the word fecaloid to describe the jungle. Another writer said, the place stank before a single body had been buried in it. The Marine and novelist William Manchester warned that a man who walked 1,000 yards into that interior without a compass would die in there from nothing but the ground. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi moved through both armies without pausing to check a uniform. In a well-fed body, those diseases are a long misery. In a body already stripped by starvation, they are quick. Men whose stomachs had failed could not hold solid food at all, and a survivor recalled that when a little rice did reach them, the worst cases could keep down nothing thicker than watery gruel. The Japanese had counted on their troops living off the land, the way they had on earlier conquests. This place gave them almost nothing. Its jungle held few things a person could eat, and grew thin against tens of thousands of mouths. Soldiers boiled weeds, chewed bark, and dug for roots that gave a starving man little back. The arithmetic of the ration told the story before any diary did. A soldier's daily rice on the island fell and fell as the runs failed, from a full measure to a third of it, then to a sixth, and then for long stretches to nothing at all. Men who had come to conquer spent their days too weak to rise, sifting the dirt for anything that might quiet the stomach. The army that had torn across Malaya and the Philippines on bicycles and nerve was being unmade here by an empty cooking pot. What the failing food line did to a body was visible from across a clearing. Men who had come ashore hard and drilled thinned week by week into a condition the survivors' accounts strained to describe. Cheeks fallen to bone, eyes grown too large, uniforms loose on frames that could no longer stand a full watch. Dysentery hollowed them from the inside while beriberi swelled their legs so the same man might be wasting and bloated at once. The living grew too weak to bury the dead, and the dead stayed where they lay at the edge of the perimeters. Officers kept up the forms of an army, the roll calls and the orders, over units that had thinned to names. By the new year, a regiment on paper might be a few dozen men who could still walk. By the last week of December, the commander of the 17th Army, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had run out of language for Tokyo. On the 23rd, he sent a signal asking leave for his men to rush the American lines and die in the open air, rather than waste away in their holes. Around 30,000 Army troops had been poured onto the islands since August. By December, some 20,000 were still breathing, and of those, maybe 12,000 could still be called fit to hold a rifle. The rest were down with wounds or fever or hunger, and the wall between those three grew thinner every week. In the first week of December, the garrison was losing about 50 men a day to hunger, sickness, and enemy fire together. Some of them died the way the recruiting posters had promised. The fighting was real, and it was vicious. When Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki flung his detachment at the Marine line along Alligator Creek in August, certain the island could be taken on nerve alone, 789 of the 917 men in his lead element were killed in one night. The pattern that followed cost more than any charge. Regiments arrived in pieces, went in against the airfield, got thrown back, and were then left in the hills without the food to recover or the ships to leave. Numbers on a page keep their distance. One regiment will not let itself be kept at arm's length. Of the roughly 1,945 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment who came ashore in August and September, 264 came off the island alive. The mosquitoes did not read shoulder patches. The Americans were sick too, and badly. Malaria ran through the Marines until the 1st Marine Division was a gaunt and shaking outfit by December, worn down enough that it had to be pulled off the line and handed to the Army's 14 Corps under General Alexander Patch. Thousands of Americans burned with fever. The island was the same for both sides, and so were the fevers that came with it. What stood behind each sick man was not the same at all. A Marine could be fed, dosed with quinine, and carried back to a hospital on a safer island. Behind a sick Japanese soldier lay an empty jungle, and in front of him a sea his own navy could no longer cross by day. The germ made no distinction between them. What stood at each man's back made every distinction that counted. Behind the American sick man stood a machine built for this. The Army and Navy had set up hospitals on safer ground to the rear at Espiritu Santo and in New Caledonia, and a steady traffic of ships and planes carried fevered men back to clean beds and medicine. Malaria discipline became an order a man could be punished for ignoring, and troops lined up for their bitter yellow atabrine tablets under an officer's eye. Set against the empty jungle across the line, it was another world. So, how many did hunger and sickness take, set against how many fell in battle? The honest answer is that the records do not line up, and anyone who offers a tidy ratio is rounding off other men's uncertainty. Something near 30,000 Japanese died on and around the island. A common accounting holds that as many as 3 of every 4 died of starvation and disease, rather than enemy fire. Other careful counts, among them one from the National World War II Museum, put battle deaths higher, near 14,800 killed in action against about 9,000 from disease, which pulls the split closer to even. What no account disputes is the shape of it. On this island, hunger and the fevers were not a footnote to the shooting. They were at least its equal, and by most tellings, its master. Guadalcanal was the first island the United States took back, and the manner of the wind set the shape of all that followed. Japan had built its war on quick conquest and short, sharp battles. It had no reply to it settled into a slow contest of supply, the one arena where American shipyards and factories could bury it. The plainest lesson of the island was that the rest of the Pacific War would turn less on courage than on tonnage, which leaves a hard thing to set down. An army can take a place without ever winning the battle for it, so long as it can keep the other side from eating. If the parts of a war that decide it are so often the parts no camera was aimed at, that is most of what this channel is here for. Subscribe, and stay for the ones nobody else is bothering to tell. The choice to give up the island was reached with cold arithmetic. At Rabaul, the staff ran war games to test whether the garrison could be saved, and the games kept returning the same verdict. Any convoy strong enough to matter would be sunk before it arrived. A staff officer named Colonel Sanada carried the recommendation to abandon Guadalcanal back to Tokyo, and on the last day of 1942, the emperor himself was told his army could not hold. By one account, a small detail with a long shadow nettled Hirohito more than the defeat. He wanted to know why his engineers had needed more than a month to build the airfield the Americans had finished, and then turned against him in a matter of days. The end came without a last stand, which was its own kind of horror. Over 3 nights in early February of 1943, Japanese destroyers slipped back down the slot and lifted around 10,600 survivors off the beaches, a good many of them too weak to climb the nets without hands reaching down to haul them up. 600 more died in the course of that evacuation, and some 3,000 of the rescued needed long hospital care once they reached safety. A doctor who received them wrote that the men's stomachs were so far gone that the worst among them could take nothing but thin porridge. Hundreds more, too sick or too deep in the jungle to reach the boats, were left where they lay. When American patrols moved up a few days later and found the foxholes empty, they called the island secure, 6 months after the first Marine had walked up its beach. Guadalcanal was the first place in the Pacific where hunger did more of Japan's dying than the enemy did, and it would not be the only one. Historians have estimated that of the roughly 1,700,000 Japanese service members who died in the war, well over half were killed not by shot and shell, but by starvation and the sicknesses that follow an empty stomach. The thing that earned one island its terrible name would repeat, larger and quieter, across the whole map of Japan's long retreat. The name outlasted the fighting. In Japan, the place is still Starvation Island, and the men who suffered there fixed a second name to it in their own tongue, clipping the long word Guadalcanal down to a single sound that fell by grim accident on the same syllable as their word for starving. 8 decades on, parties of aging veterans and the grown children of the dead still travel to the island and dig in its red earth for the bones of some 7,000 Japanese soldiers who were never found, never buried, and never carried home from the place that ate them.